is the question of the notion of journalism as being a public good. When I came into journalism, okay, it's a long time ago, but when I came into journalism, there was still the notion, a strong notion, that when you worked as a journalist, there was some element of public service involved in it. The notion that, okay, you weren't a nurse, you weren't working in the fire service, you weren't working in the police service, but there was some public good involved in what you did. And that notion of public good, unfortunately, is being eroded completely. And that's really one of the issues which I think we have to, today, is trying to restore in this debate, this dialogue, in the future of journalism, about these fundamental notions that make journalism a worthwhile profession, which allows me then to turn to an old journalist, our final speaker today. Thomas, I've already introduced you, actually.
Thank you.
And I have to say, it was very good, so you don't need to worry about it. The last time I introduced Thomas Hammerberg at the meeting was in 1984 in Edinburgh, at a Congress of the IFJ, when he was the General Secretary of Amnesty International. And I'm really, really very pleased that he's been able to join us today, because one of the big challenges that we in journalism face, and the media face, is really trying to establish a relationship with governmental organisations and with governments that is actually going to put balance back into the sort of very turbulent situation that exists regarding media and information and society today. What should governments be doing? We know what they shouldn't be doing. We've heard from Lorenzo about the problem here in Brussels and the spin culture that seeks where the politicians are trying to manipulate information. I've talked earlier about the threat that's posed by more intrusive governments and who in the name of security are chipping away at fundamental liberties and the quality of journalism. And Lee has outlined some notions about where legislation needs to be involved and so on. And you're the Commissioner for Human Rights at the Council of Europe. You have direct daily contact with governments and policymakers. We'd really like to know, what is the role that the Council of Europe can play, and what can we expect from governments in the future to try to restore some of the core values which we think are being lost in this present crisis. Thomas.
Thank you for that. My shift from journalism to full-time human rights activism was not very dramatic. It came gradually, and I'm not sure that I felt that was a different course. And in fact, I think the relationship between journalism and human rights defense is a very interesting subject. There is an interdependence there, illustrated by yourself, in fact, when you talk about the labor rights of journalists today being undermined. And also the point about public good, journalism having an element of public good. I will come back to that. Human rights activists always think about media when they plan their strategies, always. They would feel completely outside any possibility to influence if they couldn't trust some response within the media. And at the same time, human rights activists hope that journalists will find their facts, their research, an important element in their reporting. So there is a relationship there, almost symbiotic. But I also, with my background, preach to colleague human rights activists, don't take the journalists for granted. Do respect their integrity. Do not treat them as megaphones for your own organizations. That won't work. I think that most of the human rights activists now have understood that point. I got a week ago a very sad reminder of what is at stake in large parts of Europe today. A journalist and publisher in Azerbaijan, Einullah Fatulayev, was sentenced to 8 years and a half, basically for what he had done as an active publisher and a journalist. The charges were libel, insult, incitement to ethnic hatred, threat of terrorism, and tax evasion. I happened to go into that case when I was in Azerbaijan in early September and really went through the documentation of what he had written. I also discussed the case with the ministers, and I went and I was allowed to go to his cell in the Ministry of Security and discuss with him. And I'm totally convinced that there is no other purpose behind this very heavy sentence, 8.5 years, than to silence a critical voice. All the other aspects of the charge don't stand up for scrutiny. He was not only sentenced to imprisonment, he was also sentenced to a very heavy fine, more than 160,000 euros. The computers they took when they raided his office in the early spring, they were not handed back, they were confiscated. This means that the two important newspapers that he was publishing probably will now go into bankruptcy. And already when they arrested him, they ordered the papers not to be printed until the case was finished. This is a sad response to criticism against the powers in Azerbaijan. And unfortunately there are other cases, not least in the neighbor countries, in Russia, in Armenia, in Georgia, and now I just came from Albania. There are problems of the similar kind. We have not managed to establish the very basic freedom of expression, Article 10 of the European Convention in Europe today. All those countries I mentioned are of course members of the Council of Europe. So when I started working as Commissioner for Human Rights in the Council of Europe, I have been forced to go back to the basics when it comes to these so long ago agreed human rights, freedom of expression. I've had to say that journalism is not about pleasing those in power and be a mouthpiece of governments. I have had to mention the point about public good and the great importance for democracy that we have watchdogs who can operate freely and also publish freely. The court in Strasbourg, which is a bit my sort of leading guidance when I work for human rights, they have dealt with some very interesting cases when it comes to freedom of expression and journalism. And they made the point in one ruling that the freedom of expression also includes dissemination of information that offend, shock, and disturb. That offend, shock, and disturb. And this was a very important clarification that we are not only talking about freedom of expression that is normal or would be pleasing those in power. We must allow also information and publishing of reports and facts and opinions which offend, shock, and disturb. Going deeper into the case law in Strasbourg, one of course has to note that there are some limitations to freedom of expression. Hate speech, incitement to violence, and child pornography are perhaps the most clear examples of publishing that is not allowed and is actually banned in all over Europe today. And we have accepted that for obvious reasons. But what is important is that the exceptions from freedom of expression in Part 2 of Article 10 needs to be regulated very clearly by law. And that's one of the problems we have in those countries I mentioned. They are not regulated in clear legislation. And the interpretation of those exceptions must be very narrow by the courts. We have a problem there in Turkey, for instance, today, not only with Article 301 of the Criminal Code, but also some other articles, also in some other pieces of legislation, which are so vaguely formulated that it leaves to the courts, and not least the prosecutors, to interpret them in a very broad manner. And the great number of prosecutions which have been addressed against journalists during recent years as well in Turkey is a result of this very vague legislation and of course political intention by some of the prosecutors. And it's sad